It's very difficult for famous people to misbehave nowadays without the entire world finding out. There are just too many reporters and cameramen waiting to record every little slip-up.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
In the past, those who ruled over us had no such problem. They were safe from the headlines and gossip columns. Until now. Because in this program, the modern media is going to dig the dirt on one of the most notorious families in history, on the Pope, who turned out to be a woman, and on the most scandalous of all papal eras. It's going to expose the private lives of the holy men of Rome. If ever a family would have made a big, fat, juicy target for the modern media, it was the Borgias. The name is still synonymous with greed, lust, treachery, and murder. No television cameras ever bothered them, of course. No tricky headlines or awkward piece of film ever cramped their style. But at a time when the power of the church was all-pervading, it's hard to believe that a corrupt dynasty such as the Borgias would have tolerated a free press. The Borgias were actually a Spanish family who were considered coarse and ill-bred by the sophisticated Italian papal court. At their head was Rodrigo, the chief Borgia, upon whom the whole dynasty was founded.
His uncle was a bishop who in the course of time became a pope, and Rodrigo went with him to Rome and then was loaded with honors and benefices, as a result of which he became the second richest cardinal, and he was vice-chancellor of the papacy, which meant that he was the power broker and patronage man, and he went through 4 papacies, so he was shrewd. He was actually a very good administrator, and in some ways lived a rather parsimonious kind of life.
Rodrigo became Pope Alexander VI in 1492, having secured the position with a barrage of shameless bribes and payoffs. Now, the new pope had an eye for women, and not unlike leaders of more recent vintage, he saw no good reason to let the burden of office cramp his style.
While he was interested in women, there was something about him that attracted women. There was a list of short-term mistresses and long-term mistresses. I suppose you could say that there was a kind of sexual appetite.
But in the days before televised denials and tearful public confessions, there were many other things for Rodrigo to think about. Ensuring that the Borgia family enjoyed the full benefits of his new position was just one.
It was said that when he woke up in the morning, the first thing that he thought was, what can I do today to the advantage of my family?
And so, a steady stream of close and not-so-close relatives arrived to occupy plum jobs. Enough for one disgruntled, unrelated ambassador to observe that 10 papacies would not be enough to satisfy this swarm of relatives. Today, the press would have had a field day. One of those marked down for big things was Rodrigo's son, Cesare Borgia, the product of one of Rodrigo's many affairs. Being illegitimate was usually a huge drawback to progress in the church, but where there's a will, there's a way. A series of crooked commissions smoothed the way for Cesare to become a cardinal in 1493, the first steps on the road that would eventually lead to the papacy.
Cesare Borgia is one of the great bad men of history. He's the centerpiece in many ways of Machiavelli's The Prince. And he uses Cesare's customs and practice to show how to survive in the whirlpool of Italian politics. Again, with the same Borgia devotion to family, and let nothing stand in the way. So, for instance, in the first instance, he's a clergyman, and then he renounces his orders, because if the Borgia family is to continue, then he must be able to get married and beget children who can then rule the estates that are required. But he was obviously a man of some military capacity. For instance, Leonardo da Vinci, for a time, was his military engineer. So he got an eye to talent.
How the modern-day press would have loved it. It wasn't wise to bring the subject of illegitimacy up, because Cesare didn't take kindly to it. Those who did normally paid the price. So most people avoided provoking him. After all, the bad-tempered, bloodthirsty firstborn was one day going to be the head of the church. Cesare had two younger brothers. They were called Juan and Joffre. Cesare wasn't particularly fond of either of them. He was jealous of Juan because he believed Juan was his father's favorite. And he thought so little of Joffre that he slept with his wife. Mind you, she had also slept with Juan. So there was little love lost between the brothers, which made the events of June the 14th, 1497, even more suspicious. It was on the evening of that day that Juan left a small family gathering, no doubt excited at the thought of a specially arranged night of passion with a favorite mistress. 24 hours later, his mutilated body was fished out of the river Tiber.
And they said to this man who'd found the body, "Why didn't you tell anyone?" He said, "I've seen so many bodies in the river and out of the river that one more didn't seem to make any difference." And of course, it was never solved, for the body was recovered, was buried, and the Pope, incidentally, was very upset about it and said, "I know the cause of this, I know the cause of this," and went round in a demented state, but he never told anybody what he thought it was. But it was just sufficient to feed the spin doctoring that Cesare had organized the death of his brother.
Rodrigo was overcome with grief, but despite a thorough investigation, no one was ever convicted of Juan's murder. Rodrigo went out of his way to clear a number of high-profile suspects, but no mention was made of Cesare. Of course, there were no dogged medieval reporters who were determined to get at the truth no matter what. So the number one suspect got away with it scot-free. So Cesare had murdered his own brother. Poor Rodrigo simply closed his mind to the horror of such a thing and remained tight-lipped. It was family business, and therefore no business of anyone else.
Come on, mate, one more. Oh, come on.
Luckily for Rodrigo, he still had his beautiful and vivacious daughter Lucretia, the Princess Diana of her day, whom he doted on and loved dearly.
Lucretia Borgia is one of the most beautiful women in history, but nobody should pay any attention to what Donizetti does with her in his opera. She was a gracious person. I don't know quite how you interpret this. She had a slender neck and an admirable bosom. She was a very good character, but used ruthlessly by her brother Cesare and father to promote Borgia interests. And it was only at a later stage in her life, when everybody else was dead, that she came into her own as a very fine person, promoting art and culture and doing works of mercy and charity and caring after children, including Cesare's own children.
But Rodrigo's deep love for his daughter didn't prevent him from using her as a political tool when it suited him. When she was only 13, he married her off to Giovanni Sforza, a member of one of Rome's wealthiest and most influential families. The trouble was that 4 years later, Rodrigo found a better match for his lovely daughter. So, it was time for Lucretia to be a single woman again, and who better to inform Giovanni that he was suddenly an unmarried man once more than Cesare? So, Giovanni was sent packing by Lucretia's charming brother, who made it clear that not only was Giovanni free to seek another wife, it would be better for all if he searched away from Rome. So the marriage was over, but there was still the matter of the divorce. What grounds could officially be found? Rodrigo came up with a terrific wheeze. Presumably with a straight face, he suggested divorce on the grounds that the marriage had never been consummated because Giovanni was impotent. Giovanni pointed out that he had slept with Lucretia on hundreds of occasions and she'd never complained. What was more, his previous wife had died in childbirth. How on earth, he asked, could he be impotent? Explain that. So Rodrigo did. His ex-wife had been carrying another man's child. The humiliated Giovanni even offered to prove his sexual powers in front of witnesses. In the end, of course, Rodrigo got his way. Lucretia was divorced, and because the marriage had never been consummated, she was declared to be a virgin once more. Even modern-day spin doctors would surely have struggled to convince the public. There was one small difficulty with Lucretia's newly acquired virginal status. She was 6 months pregnant. Not by Giovanni, but by a handsome young page who had comforted her after the death of her brother Juan. When Cesare heard the news, he was a very unhappy man indeed. The page should have made himself scarce, but instead, he decided to throw himself at the Pope's mercy. It was a bad move. Shortly afterwards, his was another of those bodies fished out of the Tiber. Cesare had struck again. A few months later, Lucretia's baby was born, and she had been safely married off to her new husband, Alfonso of Aragon. He was the brother of Joffrey's wife, who had been so generous with her favors to the Borgia boys. It was a genuine love match. For the first time in her life, Lucretia was a happily married woman. But her love for Alfonso didn't weaken Cesare's Svengali-like grip. Cesare often traveled great distances just to spend an hour in private with his beloved sister. He was obsessed by her. He delighted in dreaming up diverting entertainments that he thought might please her. One of these was the infamous Banquet of Chestnuts.
The Banquet of the Chestnuts was the orgy to end all orgies. It was organized by Cesare in the Apostolic Palace, and anybody who was anybody was there, mainly female. He brought in, marvelous phrase, he brought in 50 honest prostitutes. And there was eating, drinking, and making merry. And stage one of the orgy was that people danced clothed, then they danced naked. Then in dimmed lights, chestnuts were thrown on the floor, and naked people, the honest prostitutes especially, expected then to pick up the chestnuts. Then rich garments were brought in. This was the grand finale. Rich garments were brought in and shown to be the first, second, and third prizes for the man that could copulate with most women in any given time. I don't know what the result of that competition was.
In the year 1500, the famous Borgia family loyalty was tested to the limit. Alfonso, like Giovanni before him, was no longer required to be Lucretia's husband. The political landscape had changed, and poor Alfonso's currency had become somewhat devalued. In short, he too had to go. Cesare was just the man for these awkward situations. There was a bungled attempt to murder Alfonso in July, and it was, of course, a tragic coincidence that he succumbed to an internal hemorrhage in August 1500, just 1 month later. But those unfortunate enough to die from the condition are rarely found with strangulation marks on their necks. Nowadays, such things would never be kept out of the press. Someone, somewhere, would leak the details. Someone, somewhere, would get some pictures. At least, Alfonso was spared the usual post-death swim in the Tiber. They simply hurried him into a humble grave. Like modern-day politicians when things go wrong, Rodrigo promised an inquiry into Alfonso's death, but, surprise, surprise, it came to nothing. Lucretia was heartbroken, but a visit from Cesare persuaded her that all was for the best. She returned to the family fold and resumed her old life. The Borgias closed ranks again. By now, Cesare was ravaged by syphilis. Even though, unlike today's well-known people, he didn't have to worry about secretly taken, unflattering pictures appearing in the press, he often wore a mask to cover the terrible sores on his face. But Cesare's lust for power remained as strong as ever, and woe betide anyone who got in his way. One of Cesare's favorite methods of dispatching those who crossed him was poison. No one knows how many victims died with a goblet in their hands, the sound of a toast in their ears, and the smiling face of a Borgia growing dim before their eyes. So it is strange that poison did for Rodrigo Borgia, who died in 1503 after accidentally drinking from a poisoned cup intended for another of Cesare's unfortunate victims.
Shit. Front page that, mate.
As for Cesare himself, he cheated his many enemies in Rome by dying on campaign in Spain in 1507. Lucretia Borgia, who history would turn into a pariah, died in childbirth in 1518, aged 39.
Well, Lucretia has a reputation as a poisoner, and Donizetti in his opera makes great play of it. But I think you've got to connect it really with the Borgia story as a whole, where they are heavily into poisoning and she just becomes part of it. And I think that Lucretia was not a poisoner, though possibly other members of the family were.
The Borgia family finally sank into obscurity, and Rodrigo's great dream of founding a lasting dynasty ultimately failed. He had sought to make the Borgia name immortal, and in that he succeeded, but only as an epithet for evil and as the benchmark for how low humans can sink. At one time, it was inconceivable that a woman should become prime minister or run for president. It couldn't even be imagined that one day women would edit major national newspapers or occupy positions of influence in the world of business.
Women have been pushed aside through history, and even now there's a lot of things where women don't get a look in.
The papacy, in particular, has always been an exclusively male domain. Each and every pope, good and bad, honest or corrupt, has always been a man. A female pope is still unthinkable. Or is it? Could it have been that a female pope actually ministered to her flock without anyone realizing she wasn't a man. Now, how would the media today react if a story like that fell into their laps? Rome in the mid-9th century was not the magnificent marble city of the classical age or Renaissance Rome with its gorgeous palaces and churches. At this period in its history, the city was a backwater. Its only significance was that it was the home of the popes, which made it the spiritual center of Christendom. The year was 857. Through the streets of Rome wound a procession, at the head of which was the Holy Father himself, Pope John. It was a rare moment of glorious pageantry in a dark and dismal age. But suddenly the Pope stopped in his tracks and collapsed to the ground. Attendants rushed to his aid and were horrified to see the Supreme Pontiff howling and writhing in agony. The cry went up for a doctor. There was panic and confusion. The Pope let out a dreadful scream. Suddenly there was blood on the cobbled streets. Hastily but carefully the papal robes were pulled back. A shocked silence fell over the scene. It was broken by the wail of a baby. The Pope had just given birth on the streets of Rome. Today, the pictures would have fetched a very tidy sum indeed.
Just want one shot, just one shot.
This is the story, then, of Pope John, who turned out to be Pope Joan, a woman doing a man's job in a man's world. She was a controversial figure in religious history long after the 9th century. They were still arguing about her at the time of the Reformation, when the Protestants split from Rome. The Protestants accused their religious opponents of trying to wipe Joan from Catholic history. For its part, Rome dismissed the whole story as a foul, slanderous lie cooked up by the heretical Protestants to mock and discredit the Catholic Church.
It was part of a propaganda campaign. The papacy was really very unpopular, and the reformers thought that the papacy was not according to Scripture, so any story that knocked the papacy was good value. And it was picked up in that way and used as a polemic to argue the case for the reformers and to knock the old church. But you need to remember also that it was actually very popular on the Catholic side, pre-Reformation. And there's about 1400, they put a bust of Pope Joan in Siena Cathedral.
If there was no truth in the story, why, asked the Protestants, was the road in which Pope Joan gave birth renamed Vicus Papaca, She-Pope Street? Martin Luther, the great 16th century church reformer, even claimed to have seen a statue in Rome dedicated to Joan and her infant son. The problem the Roman Church faced in trying to deal with Joan was that they couldn't get their story straight. While denying she had ever existed, many pious Catholics exploited her for their own ends. Anti-feminists within the faith promoted it as a cautionary tale that warned against the bad end in store for uppity women, a tale illustrating how unbridled female ambition led to vile depravity and lasting damage to the church. Some might feel that the passing of more than 1,000 years might have settled the debate about women in positions of power. Not according to Rosie Boycott, who was the first female editor of 2 popular British newspapers.
Whenever you read about a woman in a position of power, within the first 2 paragraphs, you are told what they're wearing, what their hair is like, and if they have children. And you still don't get that about a man. But it is part of a female package, and in somehow it's it's dismissive, because I think what is implied in it is that, well, she's running a company, but she's also got some children, so therefore her eye is not completely on the ball. You don't say that about a man.
So it seems the gender debate still rages. It had actually raged long before Joan appeared on the scene. There had been women priests in the 5th century who had caused bitter controversy. It was all too much for Pope Gelasius, who incredulously observed that, "We have heard that divine affairs have degenerated so far that women are encouraged to officiate at sacred altars, and all matters reserved for the male sex." So how did Pope Joan become Pope John? Joan was supposed to have been born in England, and it was said that her family were missionaries. Her father was probably a priest. There was no celibacy rule for priests at the time. She arrived in Rome in the mid-9th century. Church anti-female sentiment had not yet reached the hysterical level of the Middle Ages, when women were dismissed as misbegotten men. But the priesthood was barred to Joan on account of her sex. Absolutely. No question. There was only one way open to her if she wanted to rise to high office in the church, and that was to do it in disguise. Joan came to prominence at just the time when priests were beginning to give up their facial hair and present a clean-shaven appearance to the world. So the lack of a full-flowing beard was no longer a dead giveaway. Assuming that Joan was no great beauty and didn't have the voice of a choir boy, keeping her great secret could all be achieved with clothing, particularly clerical garb, which was traditionally sexless.
Thankfully, we don't anymore have to pretend, actually physically, to be men. But interestingly, psychologically, women still do have to pretend to be men. They're not meant to bring their own levels of femininity or feminine sensibility that far into the workplace.
So that's what she did. To the world outside, she simply became a man. Joan became John, and incredibly, no one seemed any the wiser. Joan's original ambitions probably stretched no further than ordination into the priesthood. But the problem was that she was good, very good indeed. In fact, she was a brilliant scholar, a skilled debater, a superb public speaker, and people began to take notice. These were very important people, the kind that ordained priests, created cardinals, and elected popes. Soon there was quite a bandwagon growing. Perhaps things just got out of hand. Maybe Joan just enjoyed her increasing celebrity and putting one over on the church hierarchy. But once she'd started, there was no going back. Promotion followed promotion, and before she knew it, she'd been elected Pope John. The Supreme Pontiff was a woman, and nobody knew it. In the end, as in so many things, love seems to have been Pope Joan's undoing. The one indisputable difference between a male pope and a female pope is the ability to give birth. And if Joan had wanted her tenure as the head of the Catholic Church to last longer, she really shouldn't have become pregnant. The father of her child remains a shadowy, nameless figure, a longtime sweetheart from her youth. Nowadays, the press relentlessly pursues anyone they suspect might be romantically involved with a famous person. There are entire magazines given over to the private lives of celebrities. But in those long-lost days before celebrity obsession, Joan's lover was able to remain an anonymous, humble cleric while he watched her rise to the pinnacle of the church. One thing that must be said for the man, whoever he was, he could certainly keep a secret. No one knows his fate. After Joan's downfall, some said he was attacked and killed by the angry mob. Others, that he escaped unscathed to live on in obscurity. And what is supposed to have become of Pope Joan after her spectacular curbside delivery?
There are two variations. Variation one is that she dies as a result of the childbirth. The other aspect of the story is that the crowd was so enraged that the Pope had been delivered of a child that they mobbed her, tied her to the horse's tail, and dragged her around Rome, and that killed her. But at any rate, it gets rid of the subject of the story and preserves all the element of scandal and shock horror.
And what became of Joan's baby son? He is supposed to have escaped the fury of the mob, to grow up and become a bishop. His mother would certainly have been proud of him. The story of Pope Joan has one interesting postscript. These are the words of Welsh cleric Adam of Usk, who saw Pope Innocent IV crowned in 1404, and who wrote in his account, "After turning aside out of abhorrence to Pope Joan, whose image with her son stands near St. Clement's, the Pope dismounts from his horse and enters the Lateran for his enthronement. And there he is seated in a chair of porphyry, which is pierced underneath, that one of the younger cardinals may make proof of his sex." So, Adam of Usk certainly believed that Joan existed, and even suggests that there was a 15th century gender check just to make sure nothing similar could ever happen again. At least those bad old days are behind us.
I mean, you look round the G8 and the UN at the moment, and it ain't too full of skirts.
Of course, there were many virtuous and saintly men who became pope and ruled the church with wisdom and devotion. Not all had the private lives of Satan. But even for those who took it all seriously, there were some very nice upsides. For one thing, it gave them the opportunity to have a say in non-religious affairs.
The bishops aren't in the House of Lords by accident. The bishops are in the House of Lords because they were then able to influence politics. They weren't just there to represent some ecclesiastical well-being. They were there because they influenced the political decisions of the government of the day.
It all added up to a very cozy arrangement for what nowadays would be called the establishment. But ultimately, popes were, after all, only human, and so away from the gaze of the public, they were prey to the same temptations as everybody else. Over the years, the media have had their fun with men of the cloth that have strayed from the straight and narrow, with headlines such as, "Many years ago, no one had to worry about those types of embarrassing headlines. So the public face of the papacy sometimes concealed corrupt, shameful private lives. Sometimes the corruption lasted for several papal reigns. One of the most infamous of these dark periods was known as the Reign of the Harlots."
Reign of the Harlots is a cliché title for a period when the papacy was really in the grips not only of the Roman nobility, but of at least two formidable women. So what that meant was that the women and their families were interested in getting access to the papal estates for the rent and the power and the prestige that involved. And therefore they needed a tame pope who'd do their bidding. It's an interesting fact that during this period, at least 1/3 of the popes died in very peculiar circumstances, either being strangled, poisoned, suffocated, or just disappearing. But that's That's the period of the reign of the harlots.
Theodora and her husband Theophylact were wealthy, powerful figures in early 10th century Rome. Both were senators. Theophylact also ran the local militia and controlled the papal finances. But this was a very ambitious couple indeed, and they wanted nothing less than to rule Rome in the manner of the classical emperors. Unfortunately for them, the church stood in their way. So the obvious answer was to gain control of it. What they needed was an inside man, a stooge. Luckily for them, there was a willing candidate. His name was Sergius III, who, with a little help from Theodora and Theophylact, had been elected Pope in January 904. To keep Sergius on message, and as a little reminder of who was boss, Theodora and her husband had given the Holy Father a little sweetener, their 15-year-old daughter, Marozia. Marozia proved very sweet indeed. She was soon pregnant with Sergius's child. That child was himself later to become Pope. Sergius was, quite simply, a shocker. One of the worst popes in history, and that against some pretty stiff opposition. Having already murdered the previous Pope Leo V to gain the throne, backed, of course, by Theodora and her husband, he made it his business to take revenge on those he didn't like. One of whom was another ex-pope called Formosus. Now, revenge is hardly a papal virtue. Where Formosus was concerned, it was also unnecessary. You see, he was already dead.
After Formosus had been dead 9 months, they dug him up, propped him up in a chair in full pontificals and conducted a trial. Must have been very difficult because the chap could hardly speak in his own defense. Not surprisingly, he was found guilty, and the verdict was that he was guilty, that all his acts were invalid, all his ordinations were invalid, and the 3 fingers that he'd stuck up for blessing when he'd been Pope were cut off. And that was the end of the trial. They gathered the body up and threw it in the River Tiber. The sad thing, of course, from the paparazzi point of view is that Formosa was not tinged in any way with any kind of sexual scandal. It's just they didn't like him.
With Sergius firmly in place as the supreme pontiff, Theodora and Theophylact moved smoothly into position as the power behind the papal throne. The age of the pornocracy had begun. But the best laid plans can sometimes go wrong. Theodora and Theophylact probably hadn't reckoned on their puppet pope dying after only 2 years in office. But die Sergius did, inconveniently, in 911. But by this time, the couple's power over the papal court was total. It was time for Theodora to act, and she made sure of a smooth transition by seducing her favored successor, the Archbishop of Ravenna. Thus persuaded of his holy calling, and with the best possible preparation for the office of Pope, Ravenna came to the throne as Pope John X. Theodora's personal induction ceremony had ensured that he was aware of where his priorities lay. All went well at first, but soon Theodora noticed a change in her favorite pope. She had bought him with her body, but, ungrateful wretch that he was, he refused to stay bought. Horror of horrors. It seems that John had got religion, and decided to take the job seriously. There was no media campaign for change, of course, no television debate, no help from friendly editors who were determined to stamp out corruption. None of that. Pope John slowly began to chart an independent course for the Church, deliberately distancing himself and it from the influence of Theodora and her cronies. This, of course, was not at all what she had had in mind. In the year 924, things seemed to be about to change even more radically when Theodora suddenly died. The Pope probably thought he was safe from those unpleasant outside influences. He couldn't have been more wrong, because waiting to step into her mother's shoes was Marozia, who turned out to be every bit as ruthless as her mother. This was very bad news indeed for Pope John, who paid the price for being a free spirit in the year 928.
She was just like her mother, and she deposed him because she found that stooges sometimes have a spirit of independence. And she found that the Pope was seeking independence for the papacy, and because there were serious questions to be dealt with, to do with Muslim invaders and so forth. But what she couldn't stick was that he was independent. So he was just arrested, deposed.
On one dark night during that year, Pope John X was suffocated with a pillow. Now just who could have given the order? The next two popes, Leo and Stephen, were Marozia's placemen. Simple stopgaps whose only role was to keep the papal throne warm while her son, whose father was the dreadful Sergius, remember, grew up. In March 931, she saw him enthroned as Pope John XI. It is the only recorded instance of the illegitimate son of a previous pope succeeding to the papacy. Unfortunately, there was another son, Alberic, who was less than pleased to see his half-brother get the Church's top job. Alberic had inherited all of the lovable family traits. He was ambitious, greedy, power-hungry, unpleasant, and utterly ruthless. Really not a chap to have as an enemy. Now, if Alberic was unhappy about his brother, the Pope, it was nothing compared to the displeasure he felt when he found out that his mother was intending to marry Hugh of Provence, the King of Italy, no less. Suddenly, here was another barrier to his ambitions. To make matters worse, the king insulted Alberic during the wedding celebrations. If only cameras and cartoonists had been around to record the event. Alberic was nothing if not a man of action, and he had no intention of putting up with a jumped-up half-brother doing his mother's bidding, lauding it as Pope, or for that matter, a pain-in-the-neck new stepfather who might prevent Alberic getting on in life.
Well, the son by an earlier marriage was mortally offended by this happy match, and thought that his position was threatened. So he organized a coup. They were all toppled, probably suffocated because they didn't like to shed blood, they just liked a quiet death. And the Pope was sidelined and told to just attend to his sacramental duties, and Alberic assumed political control over the area, and that was the end of all of them.
Murdering your own mother and imprisoning your half-brother was all in a day's work, of course, to those who did God's work during the reign of harlots. Alberic was merely continuing family business. And with Marozia dead and the Pope imprisoned, things were really looking up. To make it absolutely clear who was now in charge, Alberic proclaimed himself Prince of Rome and Senator of all Romans. Whoever said that crime doesn't pay? Alberic later deigned to release his half-brother from prison, but only to make him serve as a kind of personal slave. For the former pope who had tasted the high life, it was a bitter pill to swallow. He died, a broken man, 3 years later. The reign of harlots came to an end with Alberic's son Octavian, who watched over his flock as Pope John XII in the mid-10th century, and who was so morally, financially, and politically corrupt, they even formed a special synod to get rid of him. They could have saved themselves the trouble. His Holiness died in bed, someone else's bed, of course, but in bed nonetheless. It seems the enraged husband who killed him with a hammer was unwilling to share his wife, even with the Holy Father. So a dark period for the Church came to an end. Although in a wonderful irony, the reign of harlots, an era which became synonymous with gross sexual excess, helped bring about significant change.
It was the launching pad for a reform. One of the stooge popes was much influenced by the reforms that were being thought through at Cluny Abbey, and he adopted those reforms. And one of the basic ideas was to stop the church becoming the plaything of the aristocracy wheresoever they were, and to stop church resources being secularized. So one of the ideas they then had was to make the clergy celibate, because you can't have legitimate descendants if there's celibacy. It breaks the continuity. Whereas you see with the barons, they were trying to get hereditary succession, father, son, father, son. When you break that with celibacy.
Celibate popes during the reign of harlots? Now that really would have made headlines.